Welcome back to Geographic Information Systems for Disaster Risk Reduction. Welcome to Unit 5, Creating Asset Inventories to Assess Vulnerability and Resiliency. As we've said before, an asset is any material resource of value to a community. So it can be a hospital, it can be a road, it can be a person. The inventory differs from conventional asset inventories in that there must contain fragility information relating to the construction type or number of floors. Now, this is necessary for more sophisticated analysis. Basic analysis, you can just assume that co-location of the hazard and the vulnerability will create some impact, and that's a good starting point. Vulnerability of community assets will vary based on the type, magnitude, intensity, and duration of the hazard. Mechanisms to which they're exposed. So obviously, as the a flood will affect a building differently than an earthquake or will a landslide. So we have to take those into account when we're assessing how things are going to play out. Community assets are people, for starters. They're the most important asset to a community and that which needs protecting the most. They're also part of the response and the preparation and the disaster risk reduction efforts, so they're critical in all phases. What we call critical infrastructure, lifelines for transportation, and transportation can include pipelines and rails and roads, anything that moves anything, even communications. Essential services typically are thought of as housing, healthcare, markets, schools, governments, and such. Response and recovery resources, your police stations, your fire stations, and things like that. Those are critical community assets. Assets that maintain the economy and livelihoods, places where people work, places where people shop. You can't have a viable economy without markets and things like that, people to take care of their needs. And then natural and environmental resources can be part of it as well. Community assets can be thought of as either stationary, mobile, or movable, but they are material and they do exist in space and they have a location at all times. If where they are when the hazard occurs is what matters most. Each has varying resistance and susceptibility to hazards. Thus, the relationship to intensity and duration of hazards is important. They can be assessed for criticality. They can be prioritized, meaning a measure of their importance to the community. They can also be assessed in terms of real and indirect costs to a community if they're damaged or destroyed. They likely have interdependencies or risk of cascading effects when the failure of one causes the failure of one or more additional assets. This is often seen in the power grid. When the power grid goes down, it often causes other things to fail. That's a cascading effect. And it must have importance to the community in normal steady state conditions, so when outside of a disaster and in exceptional states such as a disaster response. So we've determined that assets have measurable value to a community, vulnerability to hazards, and interdependencies. They exist in reality. They have a location at all times, though some assets can be moved can move on their own. Well, not on their own, but they can move or be moved, like in a mobile home or something like that takes a little bit more effort if time allows. They can be a vulnerability or an asset or a resource following an extreme hazard event, depending on their pre-hazard purpose and their post-hazard condition. They have a very complicated, highly situationally dependent spatial challenge to assess vulnerability and resiliency, which is perfectly suited for modeling in a geographic information system. Looking at this concept of asset fragility, take a look at the graph. You can see the scenario where the probability of a damage condition occurring increases as the intensity of the shaking along the x-axis increases. So the probability of no damage or slight damage is high when there's weak shaking, and it changes considerably as you move across to the right. So as physical elements, assets are impacted by factors such as shaking, flooding, high winds. One of the most challenging aspects of detailed loss estimation and risk assessment is in determining these damage thresholds. This is where the engineers come in to determine how much wind resistance a house can handle based on certain design and construction techniques. These assets should be designed to align with your hazard inputs and need not be more sophisticated than that which the hazard intensity can support. So you have two data sets that are going to interact together. So there's no sense in having highly sophisticated hazard information if you don't have sophisticated vulnerability information. So unless you plan on upgrading the other. So when you're designing these programs, you should keep them in line with each other and make sure you're not putting too much investment in one over the other. So asset inventory comes in two major data types. Most models work this way, where you have discrete data. So you have an individual feature, like maybe a clinic, a school, a hospital, or a water treatment facility, or something like that. It's located out in your GIS, and you run a hazard model over it, and you can see the estimates that the model would say that, okay, it was flooded to this depth, and maybe you have some thresholds that say if it's flooded to this depth, it's offline or it's not usable. It's somehow incapacitated. So you have those simple thresholds in your system, and you can see how they impact a discrete individual element. But say you have 100 different medical facilities over an area impacted by high winds or floods or things like that. You can also aggregate them. So if you want to know, the cool thing about GIS is it will do that math for you. You can generate reports that will aggregate that information, bring it together, and show you the totals that are important to you. How many health clinics? How much is it going to take in aggregate to get them back online? And how much is it going to cost? So here's an example. We have a hospital, in example 1 here. It's got a high level of criticality. It's a discrete element. It's located with a latitude and longitude or a building footprint traced in the GIS. Its role is both steady state and exceptional. It's needed for everyday use, and it's also extremely important following a disaster. So you don't want it to go offline if you can help it. The population is dependent upon it, but it itself is dependent upon fuel delivery. So say the power's knocked out and you're going to be running on generators. There's only so much fuel in the tank, and you need to get fuel there. And people need to be able to physically access the site, and they are going to need water as well as eventually medical supplies and things like that. But we don't have to dive too deep here. Key parameters are the structural construction type, the number of floors, the first floor elevation. Those are important things to see how it will behave in a hazard, without getting too much into the engineering level of the resilience to or resistance to disasters, to hazards. Sorry. So the functional number of beds and specialties, that's its operational capability. So you want to know those things. You want to know how much capacity it has and what the hospital can perform. So this is a discrete type of data. Residential housing. Often in cases like this, it's hard to manage each individual element. So you aggregate them, maybe to a neighborhood or some political unit like a barrio or something. It's highly critical, but you can't effectively count every individual one. So you aggregate them and make some general assumptions about them within your models. So it's important, obviously, in steady state as people live there, and it's rarely used during disasters or in other exceptional states. There are exceptions where people are required to sort of, in order to get assistance, they're required to take some people in or things like that. Different situations can require different solutions, but in large part, it's not used. We don't impose other families on people's homes. So the dependencies are, of course, the population who live in it. It's dependent upon, depending on the culture and the level of development, electricity, water, fuel, and physical access. So very similar to the hospital. The key parameters are again construction type, but then you look at you have to break that down because there may be multiple construction types within the unit of analysis. But you do want to know how many units are there and maybe how many families and things like that. Under the functional parameters, you do want to know the capacity, how many people can be housed in those, however you measure that, whether it's by individuals or by families. So in order to build an asset inventory, you have to be methodical and put a plan together and work within your government and in your community to go ahead and implement this. So the process steps, first you need to know what you need. So you need to acquire the data as we discussed in the previous unit and find out where your gaps are. And then, some of those gaps, maybe are lower priority, but the ones you need to fill, you need to plan for data collection. Then you need to go out and collect them. But then, as you know, because this is a process, not a product, we have to plan for sustainability. So how will this data be maintained? How will it be managed? How frequently will you visit that facility and reassess? So these are things to consider right off the start. Here's just a quick example of these are the priorities for the United States government, looking at their determination of what's critical infrastructure for them. And within these, there's different categories as well. But you can sort of see that the general buckets of information type that they'll be managed, so energy, dams, commercial facilities, and things like that. So each of these is managed by a government agency. It has an owner. It is an authoritative data layer. They're properly funded and mandated to maintain this. So to know what you need to identify the assets that will be assessed in your risk analysis and prioritize them. So you don't want to send your crew out to collect everything. You want to give them a very short focus list of what's needed and send them on their way with some thoughtfully designed survey tools and methodologies. You want to consider primary and secondary uses for the data. If there's if there's longer term uses beyond this first risk assessment, you want to go after them. If there's another partner who's interested in this, but can't do it on their own, but might want to piggyback with you and collect a little bit more or different data, you might encourage that partnership and go out and many hands make light the work, they say. So bring them in and have them be a part of the activity. And if in the long run they will maintain the data, then you've got a long-term partner that's going to help you along. So you need to select the types of hazards that will be assessed, because as we said, there's a lot of different mechanisms, and that can impact your community, and you can't really plan for them all right off the bat. So you want to start off with a manageable set, whether it's floods or wind or whatever hazards you come up with first. You also want to consider the precision that your study requires. So how much detail do you need to collect? And you need to find a good balance between a lot of detail and a little detail. Insufficient detail in your analysis, your study is weak. Excessive detail and your data collection will never be done. So you got to find the right balance. You need to determine the gaps. So you build out a data model. You can build out a hypothetical data model with no initial plan to populate it, but you build the structure and you see what databases you would have to have, and you see what fields you would have to have in those databases. So when we talk about building a data model, that's what we're talking about. So you'd build a container for your data and understand what you want to put in it. in order to complete your analysis. So you do it in a manner that's aspires to doing it to the best of your ability, and you may have to scale it back a little bit, but it's good to start with, with a strong aspirational approach. So in Unit 3, as we discussed there, you want to look for all the data sources available to you, and then start lining them up so that they can, to the extent they correlate with the data you're trying to collect, you've got them mapped. Now, it could be that you combine multiple data sets into one. If there's some place that has good attribute data and another place that has good GIS geometries, maybe you bring them together, or maybe you bring multiple attribute tables together. So that can be useful. It can pose some challenges as well. So then once you line that up, then you want to populate the data model and bring in all the data you have into your data structure, and then look at where the gaps or the soft spots are, and initiate a plan to solve them. So we talked momentarily about data models, and this is just a nice example I like to use to help people understand what we're talking about. The graphic on the right shows sort of a musical data model here, where you have albums and artists and musicians and labels and album reviews and track reviews. And this shows how, in this data model, how all these things are wired together. And you notice there are multiple tables, and each line in the table indicates what would be a column in a database. So it's just showing the fields that would be in the spreadsheet or database table, in the database table. So you can see, if you look carefully at that and you follow through, you can see how an album relates to an artist. An artist goes, a band may have multiple members, made up of musicians, and this all interrelates and makes a good amount of sense. So in a sense, what we're trying to do is build a data model that will have hazards and vulnerabilities and all the fragility aspects and things like that we've been discussing. These fields may be restricted. These are not all places where you can just type in whatever you want to type. You may have to go ahead and set some standards as to what can be put in there, and the software can facilitate that by putting in like domain controls, as they call it, which will limit the user, like a pick list I'm sure you've seen on websites and things, where you're constrained in what you can select. So in planning for data collection, this can be the most burdensome aspect, and you should really think it through. You want to think carefully about the technique. How are you going to use it? What tools are you going to use? How can you keep it simple and technologically sound? You don't want to send people out there and have them lose data or collect erroneous data. You don't want to have to train them for a month to send them out, so especially if they're volunteers. So you want to find a nice balance of technique to keep it simple, keep it solid, and keep it useful. So you want it to be complete. You want to cover the entire study area. You want to cover it as quickly as possible too. You don't want it to take 2 months to go over. Depending on what you're collecting, your methods may change, your people may change, your data consistency may fall off. So you want to consider the safety of the staff out in the field. You certainly don't want anyone getting hurt or injured or anything. So sometimes going out in different places requires a little bit of strategy to make sure you have teams that are together. Maybe consider the gender makeup of your teams, the time of days they go, the days of the week they go, things like that, to try and ensure that they're effective and safe at the same time. You want to do ongoing and early validation from the first data that comes in. You want to take a careful look at it and make sure that everything's being collected properly. You don't want to get too far down the road and find out that you have to start over, or worse, complete the entire data collection and realize that there was some problem with half of the GPSs and they don't line up, and you don't know how to work it out. So quality control immediately as the data starts coming in. As we mentioned earlier, consider opportunities to collect what you can from imagery with heads-up digitizing and maybe tracing buildings and roads and things like that to minimize the burden of the field validation team. So maybe they go out and they don't have to collect a GPS point. They can just attach what they collect to a structure that's already in the database. This has been used widely with OpenStreetMaps, where people from around the world can trace the buildings and trace the different features in the community, and the local NGO or local volunteers can go out and just collect the data that only they can collect, that which you can perceive at ground level. So it's a good way to distribute the work as well, and fold in other partners. Make sure it's very clear, what's to be collected and where from your team. Keep them well organized. You certainly want to minimize the use of free text fields, a lot of notes and things like that. And as we said before, try and provide some controls, so it saves them time in collecting it, and it allows you to aggregate the data and do more analysis if it's collected systematically like that. So as I said, you should conduct it in the shortest period of time that's reasonable. You don't want it to drag on. You should consider ongoing maintenance. How long? When will you revisit these locations? When will you do it again? Is it something you can do annually? Or, as we said, is it something you can find partners with others to help maintain it over time, or to maintain it collaboratively to, again, share the load? The final thing is to plan for maintenance and handoff. This data needs to stay alive, so it needs to be tuned up and modified. If errors are found, it needs to be cleaned up. We've talked about finding partnerships and setting up relationships with other organizations. What's important about that, though, is if you do it, to document it so that it's clear to everyone and the expectations are set, and the work is followed through on. So don't leave it to handshakes and gentlemen's agreements, largely because positions change, and the person you have an agreement with may be completely honorable, but they may not be there in a year when you need to go back and do it again. So it's important to take your time and make sure these agreements are documented. Okay, for this, you can now find some information in your Lab 4 folder that will give you some insights into executing the OpenStreetMap exercise. In conclusion, simple vulnerability inventories can be developed from existing data, enhancements to existing data, or through creation of new data. The challenge in doing so is developing the fragility aspect. This is where the real sophistication comes in, but we don't have to let that hold us back. The collection of an inventory is best done in partnership with an organization that has a long-term stake in the data, who can support or benefit from your efforts, and who can maintain it going forward. Thank you again for completing this unit, and look for the quiz on the course sites, and good luck. Thank you.